In the spring of 2014, on the edge of a rice operation outside Stuttgart in Arkansas County, a mill foreman named Glenn leaned on the top rail of a fence that did not belong to him and told the woman standing on the other side of it that what she was raking into a pile was, in his exact words, yard trash. He said it kindly. That was the thing about Glenn that nobody who tells this story can leave out. He was not unkind. He had a 2-year degree in agricultural operations and 11 years running the dryer floor at the largest rice mill in the county. And he believed, the way a man believes the floor will hold his weight, that the husk left over after milling was a disposal problem and nothing else. For 10 years, his mill had been dumping that husk along Mai's fence line because it was cheaper than hauling it to the landfill. And for 10 years, Mai had said nothing about it. Now she was raking it. Glenn watched her rake it and felt sorry for her in the way you feel sorry for someone who has not understood the situation they are in. 8 years later, in the fall of 2022, a buyer for a restaurant's supply group out of Memphis signed a single purchase order across Mai's kitchen table. And the number written on that order was larger than the gross revenue of the mill's entire byproduct division for that year. I am going to tell you how a pile of what a credentialed man called yard trash became that number. Because the story sits exactly on the line between what a system measures and what is actually worth something. And almost nobody was standing on the right side of that line until the arithmetic forced them there. Stay with this one. The middle is where it lives. Let me tell you about Mai first, because the dismissal does not land unless you know what was being dismissed. Mai Tran was 57 years old that spring, and she had farmed and worked the same 40 acres at the elbow of a county road for most of her adult life. Her family had come to the Grand Prairie in the late 70s, drawn by the one thing the region had that looked like home, which was flat, wet ground that grew rice. Her grandfather had grown rice in the Mekong Delta before any of them crossed an ocean, and he had carried with him not money, because there was none but a habit of mind and a thin notebook bound in oilcloth. Mai was known for 2 things in the county. She was known for being quiet to the point that people forgot she was in a room, and she was known for never throwing anything away. That second thing was the one Glenn could not read. To Glenn, the husk along the fence was waste, a thing the mill paid to be rid of. To Mai, it was the raw material of a craft her grandfather had written down by hand 50 years before any of them owned an acre of American dirt. The county saw a poor woman with a small operation and an unfashionable refusal to expand. What the county could not see, because it had no column for it, was that Mai was sitting on the only piece of inherited knowledge in 3 townships that turned a disposal cost into a product. The thing about rice is that the part people eat is the smallest part of it. For every 100 pounds of rough rice that comes off a field, roughly 20 pounds of it is hull, the hard outer husk that protects the grain. That hull is almost pure silica and lignin, which is a fancy way of saying it is hard, sharp, and slow to rot. You cannot feed much of it to cattle. It will not compost without a fight. Mills across the Rice Belt have spent decades trying to figure out what to do with the mountains of it they produce, and the cheapest answer, for a long time, was to pile it somewhere out of the way and forget it. Glenn's mill had chosen Mose's fence line as that somewhere, with her grudging permission, back in 2004. Mai had let them do it on purpose. Let me tell you what her grandfather's notebook actually contained, because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is the whole story. In the Delta, her grandfather had built and tended what the book called a kiln, a low earthen mound in which wood or dense plant matter is burned in the near absence of air. When you burn something in open air, it turns to ash and smoke and gives up everything it has. When you heat that same material, hot but starve it of oxygen, it cannot fully combust. The volatile parts cook off, but the carbon skeleton stays behind, hardened and concentrated. That process is called pyrolysis, and the black, ringing, almost metallic substance it leaves is charcoal. Her grandfather had made it from bamboo and hardwood scrap. He had also, in 3 patient pages, near the back, made it from rice hull. Rice hull is a miserable thing to turn into charcoal, which is exactly why it had value. It is light and loose and burns to gray ash if you so much as look at it wrong. But heated slowly in a sealed chamber, at a temperature her grandfather recorded in the notebook, as the heat where straw glows but does not flame, the silica in the hull does something useful. It forms a rigid scaffold that holds the carbon in place. What comes out is not the fragile briquette you buy at a gas station. It is a hard, porous carbon, with a surface area so vast that a single handful, unfolded, would cover a pasture. That porosity is the entire point. It is why activated carbon filters water and air. It is why the best grilling charcoal in the world burns long, clean, and hot. Mai knew this the way she knew her own hands, because her grandfather had made her rebuild his test kiln 3 times the summer. She was 14, until she got the seal right. She had resented him for it that summer. The first seal she built leaked at the lid, and the hull inside flared and burned to nothing, and her grandfather said only that air was the enemy, and that she would build it again. The second leaked at the base, where the chamber met the firebox, and the char came out half ash and half raw, and he said again that air was the enemy, and that she would build it again. The third held, and when she raked out a tray of hull char that was black all the way through and rang when she stirred it, he did not praise her. He took a single piece, snapped it between his fingers to show her the honeycomb inside, and said that this, the unseen room inside the carbon, was where all the worth was kept. Then he wrote 3 lines in the notebook, in a hand she could barely read, and told her the book was hers now. She was 14. She did not understand what she had been handed for another 40 years. The notebook itself was a plain thing, no thicker than a church bulletin, its oilcloth cover gone soft and dark at the corners from handling. Most of it was rice, the Delta kind, planting dates and water depths, and the names of varieties that no longer existed. But the last 7 pages were the kiln. Page 9 held the principle, drawn in cross-section, the inner chamber inside the outer fire, the pipe that carried the cooked-off gas back under the floor. Page 11 held the temperatures, written not in degrees, because he had owned no thermometer, but in colors, the shade the smoke turned, and the dull red the chamber wall showed in the dark. And the last 3 pages held the hardest thing he ever made, which was charcoal from rice hull, with a note in the margin that Mai had read so many times the ink had worn pale under her thumb. The note said that the hull fights you because the hull is mostly stone, and that the thing which makes it fight you is the same thing that makes it worth the fight. So when Glenn called it yard trash, he was technically describing the most concentrated raw material for a high-value product within 40 miles, and he had been delivering it to her door for free for a decade. Mai did not correct him. She almost never corrected anyone. She finished raking, and she said one thing, which I will give you, because it is the only sentence she spoke in that whole exchange. She said, "You keep bringing it. I will keep taking it." Glenn laughed, told her to suit herself, and got back in the mill truck. He drove off thinking he had done a charitable thing by humoring the Husk lady. He had, in fact, just renewed for free a supply contract for the raw material that would eventually embarrass his entire division. Let me tell you about the man who did not laugh, because every story like this one needs someone walking the loud road beside the quiet one. Earl farmed 800 acres of rice 2 miles east And Earl was, by every measure the bank used, the most successful operator in that stretch of the county. In 2014, Earl had just taken delivery of a new self-propelled sprayer that cost more than Mai's entire farm was assessed at, a green machine that stood taller than a man at the wheel, and could cover in a morning what his father had walked behind a mule to do in a week. He had financed a grain dryer and 3 center pivots on top of a note he was already carrying. Earl was not a fool. Earl was doing exactly what the extension meetings, the equipment dealers, the seed reps, and the loan officers all told him to do, which was to get bigger, get more efficient, and drive his cost per bushel down. By spreading his fixed costs across more acres, the whole system pointed the same direction. Every voice he respected aimed the same way, and Earl, being a sensible man, followed it. There was nothing reckless in it. It was the safe road, the recommended road, the road with a paved shoulder and a sign at every turn, and that was exactly the trouble with it, though no one could see the trouble yet. I want to be fair to Earl the way the story has to be fair to Glenn. Earl was generous. Earl loaned Mai a tractor the year, hers through a rod, and would not take gas money for it. When Earl looked across the road at Mai's 40 acres and her refusal to grow, he did not feel contempt. He felt a neighborly worry, the worry of a man who has bet everything on a road and cannot understand why someone he likes will not get on it with him. That worry is its own kind of pressure, and Mai felt it every time he stopped by. The first person to put real pressure on Mai, though, was her own family. In the summer of 2015, Mai's niece Lee came home. Lynn was 24, had a degree in agricultural economics from a good university, and had spent 2 years at a commodity trading desk before deciding, to her parents' alarm, that she wanted to come back and help her aunt actually make money. Lynn loved Mai. She also thought Mai was throwing her life away on 40 acres and a fence full of garbage, and she said so, not cruelly, but with the clean confidence of someone who has run the numbers and believes the numbers are the world. Lynn's first month home, she made a spreadsheet. She showed Mai that the 40 acres of rice cleared in a good year, less than what a starting analyst made in a city. She showed her the cost of the husk pile in lost fence line acreage. She used the word inefficient, and then she used it again, and Mai let her finish. When Lynn was done, Mai took her out to the small steel chamber behind the barn. A thing Ling had assumed for years was a broken-down smoker, and Mai lit it. Let me tell you what Ling saw, because this is where the demonstration begins. Mai had built over many years and many failures a closed retort, which is a sealed metal chamber inside a firebox. You burn fuel in the outer box. The heat passes through the wall and cooks the rice hull sealed in the inner chamber, but no flame touches it, and almost no air reaches it. The gases that cook off the hull are piped back under the chamber and burned as fuel. So once the thing is running hot, it largely heats itself. It is patient, ugly, brilliant engineering, and her grandfather had sketched its principle on page 9 of the oilcloth notebook in 1968. Lynn watched her aunt seal the chamber, watched the smoke that came off it go from white and acrid to thin and nearly clear as the volatile gases burned away inside, and watched, 6 hours later, Mai rake out a tray of black hull char that rang faintly when she stirred it. Ling crouched over the tray a long time. She picked up a piece and snapped it the way her great-grandfather had once shown Mai, and she saw the honeycomb inside, the unseen rooms, and something in her face changed that she did not yet have a name for Sue. She had a degree, and a spreadsheet, and 2 years on a trading desk, and she did not have a single column anywhere in her files for what she was looking at. She asked one question that evening. She asked how much a pound of that was worth. Mai said she did not know yet. because she had never tried to sell it. She had only ever made it. That answer should tell you everything about why I, the county, misread my. She was not running a business. She was keeping a craft alive, and the business had not yet caught up to the craft. Linked, to her great credit, was the first person to see that the gap between those two things was not a flaw. It was an opening, but the seeing did not arrive that night. It arrived in pieces over 2 years, and the first piece was small. The next morning, Ling did not pick the spreadsheet back up. She went out to the chamber before her aunt was awake, and she stood looking at it in the gray light, and Buck came and sat beside her as if he had been assigned to. She did not understand the thing yet, but she had stopped being certain it was nothing. And for a person built the way Ling was built, the end of certainty was the whole beginning. For the next 2 years, while Earl added acres and Lynn ran experiments, the two women turned a craft into a product without ever once telling the county what they were doing. Learned the chemistry her aunt knew by feel. She learned that the same hull char, heated a second time in steam, becomes activated carbon, the stuff that pulls chlorine out of city water and odor out of refrigerators. The steam, Mai explained, drives off the last of the tars, clogging the pores, and opens millions of new ones, so the surface area of a single gram climbs into the hundreds of square meters. Who had once priced commodities by the carload, found herself measuring worth by the square meter of empty space. Inside a black grain she could barely feel in her palm. She learned that ground fine and pressed with a little starch as a binder. The cooking-grade char held together as a hard lump that a grill chef would pay a premium for, because it burned long and clean and threw no chemical taste into the food. They were doing in a barn what 3 universities had written papers about, and no mill in the region had bothered to attempt, because the mills measured their husk in tons of disposal, and Mai measured hers in grades of carbon. Ling's doubt did not vanish all at once. It cracked the day she carried a 5-pound bag of the lumped charcoal to a barbecue competition in Memphis, and a pitmaster she had never met lit a pot chimney of it, watched it come up to a clean, even heat with no flare and no sour smoke, and walked the length of the lot to find her and ask where she got it. He did not ask the price first. He asked where, which is the question a craftsman asks when he has already decided he wants the thing. It cracked further when a man who ran a water filter shop bought 4 pounds of the activated grade, ran it across a column to test it, and came back 2 weeks later for 40, then for 400. Somewhere in there, without announcing it, Lynn stopped being the skeptic who had made the spreadsheet and became the woman who drove the samples to the cities and slept in her truck at the Janet P. Fairgrounds to hold a booth. She started asking to see the notebook. Mai started letting her, a page at a time, the way her grandfather had given it to her. Slowly, so that the knowing would stick. Which brings us back to Glenn, and to the mill, and to the slow turn of the larger world that none of them controlled. In the fall of 2018, the mill held an open house, the kind of community event where manager stands up and talks about throughput and efficiency. And Glenn, now operations manager, gave the talk. Mai and Lynn were in the back row, not because they cared, because the church across the road was using the parking lot, and they had walked over for the free coffee. During the question period, a younger farmer asked Glenn what the mill did with all its hull. Glenn, comfortable and fluent in front of his own people, said the mill was studying its options, but that frankly, the stuff was a boutique liability, useful to nobody, and the mill would be glad to be rid of it. He smiled when he said it. He had no idea. The 2 people who had been quietly turning that liability into graded carbon for 4 years were sitting 20 feet behind him, drinking his coffee. Lynn started to stand. Mai put a hand on her arm, and Lynn sat back down. It was not yet time. Let me tell you about the dog, because Buck belongs in this story, and Mai would not forgive me for leaving him out. Buck was a rangy brown cattle dog cross, who had no cattle to work, and had appointed himself foreman of the charcoal yard instead. He slept against the warm wall of the retort on cold nights. He followed Mai from the fence pile to the chamber and back, and he had a habit, when the smoke ran clear and the burn was right, of lying down and going still, as if the rightness of it satisfied him too. Lynn learned to read the burn partly by reading Buck. When the dog was restless, the seal was leaking. When the dog slept, the carbon was good. By 2020, the operation had a name. Lynn insisted on it over Mai's objection that a thing did not need a name to be real. They called it Husk, one word, because that was what it was, and because the name was a quiet joke, at the expense of everyone who had ever called it trash. They sold cooking-grade lump to restaurants and competition cooks, and activated grade to a water treatment outfit and 2 aquarium suppliers. And they did it all out of a barn with a single retort and a second-hand grinder. And they refused repeatedly to borrow money to get bigger. Lynn wanted to scale. Mai would not. Mai said the land and the one chamber could make a certain amount of good carbon. And the moment they made more than that, they would start making bad carbon. And bad carbon would kill the name faster than no carbon ever could. They argued about it. Mai won, because it was her notebook and her seal and her name on the fence. Then came 2021, and the world tilted in a way that decided the argument no human in the county could have decided. Let me tell you what happened, because this is the shock, and the shock does the work that no spreadsheet and no open house speech ever could. 2 things broke at once. The first was the price of natural gas and propane, which roughly doubled across that year and into the next. The second was the price of rice, which slid in the same window as global stocks rose and the export market softened. For an operator like Earl, those 2 lines crossing was a catastrophe written in arithmetic. Earl dried his rice with propane. Earl irrigated and ran his equipment on diesel that tracked the same energy curve. Earl carried a note that assumed a rice price he was no longer getting, and an energy cost half of what he was now paying. Every efficiency that had made Earl the model operator in 2014 was, in 2022, a fixed cost he could not shrink fast enough. I want to be careful here, because the niche this story belongs to has a bad habit of gloating over men like Earl, and that is not what this is. Earl had done everything right by the only map anybody had handed him. The map was just drawn for a world that stopped existing. In the late spring of 2022, Earl sat at Mai's kitchen table, the same table the purchase order would later be signed on, and he turned his cap in his hands the whole time. The way a man does when his hands need something to do that is not the thing he came to say. He told her the dryer alone had cost him near double to run that harvest. He told her the new sprayer he had been so proud of in 2014 sat under a tarp because the spraying it did could not earn back the diesel it drank at. The price diesel had become. Then he told her the bank had started using a word he had never expected to hear about his own operation. He did not finish the sentence. His voice went out from under him in the middle of it, and he looked at the table. Mai did not make him finish. She poured coffee and let the broken line sit there. Broken the way the people in this county let hard things be hard. Buck came and put his head on Earl's knee, and Earl scratched the dog's ear without seeming to know he was doing it. And for a while, the only sound in the kitchen was the dog's tail against the floor. Here is the part the arithmetic makes unforgettable. That same energy spike that was strangling Earl barely touched Mai. Her retort, once running, heated itself on its own cooked-off gas. The propane that doubled in price was a line item she had engineered almost entirely out of her process years before. Not because she had foreseen the spike, but because her grandfather had built his kiln in a place and time where fuel was scarce. And a process that wasted heat was a process that failed. The very thing that made her method look primitive and small to Glenn, that it ran on its own waste gas and a pile of free husk, was the thing that made it nearly immune to the shock that broke the largest, most efficient operators in the county. In 2022, Earl's cost to dry and move his crop rose by an amount that ate his already thin margin alive. In that same year, Mai's cost of energy per pound of finished charcoal rose by almost nothing, because she had almost no purchased energy to begin with. That is the contrast, stated in numbers, and the numbers are the verdict. Earl lost 200 acres to the bank that winter, sold at a price that did not cover the note. Mai lost nothing because she owed nothing. Her one chamber kept turning free husk into carbon, that the world, it turned out, wanted more of every month. The bill felt the same shock from the other side. With rice margins thin, every cost the mill carried came under the knife, and the cost of trucking and managing its husk, the boutique liability Glenn had joked about, was suddenly a line somebody upstairs wanted gone. Glenn was told to find a buyer for the hull, or find a cheaper way to dump it. He spent the better part of 2022 calling around the rice belt, learning that nobody wanted the stuff, that it was as worthless as he had always believed. And then, someone at a regional supply conference mentioned, in passing, that there was an outfit in his own county turning rice hull into premium charcoal and selling it to restaurants in 3 states. The name of the outfit was Husk. The address was a barn on a county road. The fence at the front of that barn was the same fence the mill had been dumping against for 18 years. Let me tell you about the day the buyer came. Because the reveal lives here and it is quiet, the way these things are when they are real. The buyer was a woman named Hess, a senior purchasing director for a restaurant supply group that fed kitchens across the Mid-South. She had been sent because 3 of her best accounts had independently asked for the same lump charcoal by name. And a buyer at that level does not chase a product unless the demand has already made the decision for her. Hess did not come to negotiate. She came to confirm. She walked the yard. She watched a burn run from white smoke to clear. She picked up a piece of the finished lump, turned it in the light, and tapped it against the steel of the chamber, and it rang. She held it a long moment. Then she asked Mai one question, the only question that mattered, which was, how much of this can you make in a year without making it worse? Mai told her the honest number, the small number, the number that came from 1 chamber and 40 acres, and a refusal to scale past what the craft allowed. Hess did not flinch at how small it was. She had spent 20 years buying for kitchens, and she had learned the hard way that the things which can be made in unlimited quantity are usually the things worth nothing, and that the worth and the scarcity were the same fact seen from 2 sides. She understood, the way the right kind of expert always does, that the smallness was the quality. She took out the purchase order, and she wrote a figure for a year of Mai's full output at a price per pound that Lynn had to read twice and then read a 3rd time, and she slid it across the kitchen table without a word about negotiating it, because she had not come to negotiate, she had come to secure. The number landed in that kitchen with a force entirely out of proportion to the ink it took to write it. Ling, who had built a spreadsheet 8 years earlier, proving this farm could never clear what a city analyst made, sat down slowly in a kitchen chair. Mai did not sit. Mai looked at the order, and then she looked out the window at the fence, and the pile that was no longer yard trash, and she did not say anything at all. Nobody spoke for a while. Buck, asleep against the warm wall of the retort, did not stir. The propane that had broken Earl sat at a price the news called historic. The mill that had called the Husk a liability was, at that very hour, paying to truck the same material to a landfill 3 counties over, because it had not occurred to anyone there that the woman at the fence had solved their problem in a barn before they knew they had one. And on the kitchen table sat a single sheet of paper with a number on it larger than the gross revenue of the mill's entire byproduct division for the year. Glenn heard about it the way everyone in a small county hears about everything, which is sideways and within a week. To his credit, and this is the recalibration the story has been waiting for, Glenn did not get angry, or rather he did not stay angry. He drove out to Mize one afternoon that fall and stood at the fence again, on the same rail, in nearly the same spot. He looked at the chamber and the grinder and the bagged carbon stacked under the eave, and he was quiet for a while. Then he said the thing that converts a doubter into a student. He asked if she would show him how it worked. He said the mill produced 400 tons of the stuff a year, and he had spent his whole career thinking it was garbage, and he would like, before he retired, to understand what he had been throwing away. Mai showed him. Of course she showed him. That is the other half of who she was. The half the county also could not measure, which was that she had never once been stingy with the knowledge, only with the words. She walked Glenn through the retort, the seal, the self-fueling gas, the second heating that made the activated grade. She let him hold a piece of the finished lump and tap it and hear it ring. Glenn, 50-some years old, with a degree in agricultural operations and a career, built on the certainty that waste was waste, learned the truth of the thing in an afternoon, and he had the grace to thank her for it. Let me tell you what Mai did with the money, because this is the moral center of it, and the niche does not let me skip it. She did not buy a sprayer. She did not borrow against the contract to build 10 more chambers and chase a number. She paid off the small debt she had, which was almost nothing. She built 2 more retorts, no more, because 2 more was what 1 more pair of hands could tend well. And she hired the pair of hands from among the families who had lost ground in the crash, including a man named Royce, who had worked Earl's place before the bank took it, and who turned out to have the patience the seal demanded. She set Ling up not as an employee, but as a partner, with her name on the operation beside Mai's own, and she had the notebook copied, page by oilcloth page, into a bound form that would outlast the original. With the colors of page 11, translated at last into numbers a thermometer could hold. And she did the thing that mattered most to her, which she had been quiet about for years. She started teaching the method to anyone in the county who wanted it, in the barn, on Sundays, for nothing. Word went around slowly and then not slowly. A widow with 30 acres came. 2 brothers who had given up on rice came. Royce brought his cousin. And eventually the mill itself came, because the arithmetic that had made the Husk a liability now made it an asset. And Glenn, near the end of his career, would rather sell the stuff than dump it. The mill that had dumped Husk at her fence for a decade signed an agreement to sell its hull to a cooperative of small charcoal makers Mai helped organize, Earl among them, working a few acres of his old ground again, with a chamber instead of a combine. The boutique liability became, for 30 families on the Grand Prairie, a line of income that did not blink when the price of propane doubled, because it ran on the one thing the rice belt would never run short of, which was the part of the rice that nobody ate. Earl ran one of those chambers. The man who had been the model of the loud, efficient road learned the quiet one from the woman he had once pitied, and he learned it without bitterness, because Mai never once let the learning feel like a defeat. To the bank, Earl's 200 lost acres had been a number in a column. To Earl, by the end, they were the thing that had finally turned him toward a kind of farming that could not be broken by a line on an energy chart. Here is what the whole thing means, and I will say it plainly, because the story has earned the right to. There are two kinds of knowing in this world. One is wide and fast and confident, and it measures everything that is easy to measure, and calls the rest a liability. It builds bigger and runs leaner and looks right up until the morning it doesn't, like the only sensible way to live. The other is narrow and slow and patient. It stays on one piece of ground for 50 years and learns it the way you learn a face. It keeps the notebook. It does not throw the husk away. The first kind of knowing wrote Glenn's speech and drew Earl's map and built the spreadsheet Linge carried home. The second kind of knowing was sealed in an oilcloth book in a steel chamber behind a barn, waiting the way the right answer waits for the world to need it. What a system measures and what is actually valuable are two different things, and the gap between them is where people like Mai live their whole lives unseen, doing the patient work that no column is built to hold. The husk was always worth something. It was worth something the day Glenn called it trash, and the day Hess signed the order. And the only thing that changed in between was that the arithmetic finally found a column for what Mai had known. Since she was 14, rebuilding a kiln seal in the Delta summer until it held. The notebook sits now in a fireproof box in the barn, copied twice, with Lynn's handwriting, filling the margins her grandfather left blank. The fence still stands where Glenn leaned on it. There is no more husk piled against it, because none of it goes to waste anymore. And on a cold night, when one of the three chambers is running, and the smoke goes from white to clear, an old brown dog still finds the warm wall and lies down against it and goes still, the way he always did when the carbon was good. What is rigid breaks. What is patient keeps the heat.